Let's take a few minutes to look at ozonolysis. Ozonolysis is when we react a molecule of ozone, O3, with an alkene. And the alkene can be in a chain, as we see here. It can be in a ring. There can be more than one alkene present. The ozone is going to react with the alkene. And this is, I think, a very cool mechanism, very cool reaction, because we're going to produce ketones and aldehydes from this reaction, and we have not yet discovered a method of producing those functional groups yet. So this is going to be a key reaction if our desired goal is to produce a ketone or an aldehyde. Also, this reaction is a method of removing some carbons. So maybe our goal is to cut off a couple carbons on our molecule. This is one way we can do that. So we're going to draw the ozone molecule in its Lewis structure. I'm going to put formal charges here. Of course, there are lone pairs on those oxygens. I'm not going to draw them in just to have a slightly nicer looking drawing here. And then I'm going to try to use a different color for my arrows. But you can see that this Lewis structure of ozone probably is nucleophilic at this O-. And indeed, that would attack the alkene, pushing the alkene electrons towards the top carbon here. But they don't stop there. They actually continue along to form a bond to this oxygen, which can finally push the pi bond onto the positively charged O, giving us a neutral formal charges overall. So let's draw what that looks like. So I'm going to redraw the skeletal structure here. And of course the single bond is still there. The pi bond is not. And I made a bond between that first O and the bottom carbon of the alkene. That O is still connected to two other oxygens, and that top oxygen is also connected to the other carbon of the alkene. So there's my resulting structure. I'm going to put lone pairs here just so we can keep track. In this case, it's not too obtrusive. And you can see that we have neutral atoms, neutral formal charges all over the place. And then scientists who've studied this reaction discovered that this is called a ozonide. And this ozonide decomposes and reforms a different ozonide, which is a little more stable. You may have heard in our discussions this semester that the OO single bond is very weak. And in this case, we have two of those in this molecule, so it is pretty, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that it might fall apart. And it falls apart in this manner. I'm going to use red arrows again. So the CC bond breaks and forms a pi bond to one of the oxygens. That bond breaks so that I don't overfill the octet of that oxygen. And lastly, one of these lone pairs forms a pi bond with the bottom carbon so that it does not have an incomplete octet. Because you can see that the first arrow that I drew is going to cause this carbon to have a fewer than 8 electrons in its octet unless I draw this second arrow, or the third arrow here, forming a pi bond to that carbon. So let's redraw what I have done here. So there's my 6 carbon chain at the bottom. I formed a pi bond to the O. I'm going to try to draw them in the same position, and then we will rearrange them so that draw them a little nicer. So that oxygen is connected to another oxygen, and I believe that this red arrow is causing a third lone pair to appear on this oxygen, so that would give it a negative charge up here. Of course, this oxygen has 3 bonds to it, so that would have a positive charge. And then I have my methyl group and my newly formed pi bond right there. So this is a newly formed pi bond from this arrow. I broke the bond between these two oxygens with this red arrow, forming a negative oxygen, and then I formed a new pi bond between the oxygen here and this carbon so that every atom in this drawing has a complete octet. Then I'm going to redraw this. I'm going to draw this carbonyl a little bit further away. We're going to make some long bonds now. And so I'm going to reform the cyclic structure, but with only one OO single bond. Almost the same three arrows are going sort of in a backwards fashion. So now you can see that I've created a cyclic structure. I'm going to draw the 6 carbons on the bottom here. There's my 2 oxygens that were on those 6 carbons. This oxygen made a bond to a carbon that had a methyl on it. That carbon had an O, and that O is now attached to the carbon down there. So this is called also an ozonide. But as you can see, there's only one OO single bond instead of 2 OO single bonds. So we have a more stable ozonide here. So this is where we are after step 1. We've done step 1 now. We've formed this ozonide. And a lot of books don't show this next step, and I don't really know why. It's actually pretty straightforward. We're going to decompose this ozonide in the presence of dimethyl sulfide. So this is just sulfur connected to 2 methyls. Sulfur is very nucleophilic. It forms good bonds to oxygen. And so what we're going to do is basically reduce this ozonide so that it forms the 2 carbonyls and we lose one of these oxygens. Remember that this bond is weak, and so we can break that bond by attacking it with the sulfur as a nucleophile. So here I'm going to draw the sulfur attacking the oxygen, and then I'm going to draw the oxygen-oxygen bond breaking, forming a pi bond. And I'm going to draw this CO bond breaking again, so I don't overfill this octet, forming an O-. And let's see what that looks like then as our what that results in. And I'm going to use blue here. And I formed a pi bond here. And I believe that's all for that molecule. I've broken the CO bond here. This is a negative charge. This oxygen is attached to the sulfur. That sulfur should have a positive charge because it's given up one of its lone pairs. And I still have an overall neutral molecule. And I formed one of my products, this carbonyl species. And I can show how we lose the extra oxygen. I can form a carbonyl there. And I can lose that oxygen via cleavage of the CO bond. And then I can draw my products. I'm going to redraw the first ketone that I drew. And now this molecule is just 2 carbons and an O. I've got a pi bond between the C and the O, and that's it. And as a byproduct, I have dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO. We saw this as one of our solvents in the substitution reactions. So that's a byproduct, DMSO. Okay, so you'll notice that the ozone has cleaved the pi bond, and wherever the pi bond was, I had 2 carbons attached to the pi bond. Now I have 2 carbons attached to a carbonyl, or as part of a carbonyl. Then I have this 6 carbon chain. On the 3rd carbon, I used to have a CC double bond. Now I have a CO double bond. So now that we've learned this mechanism, we don't actually need to draw the mechanism every time. We can pretty much just imagine cutting that pi bond and adding an O to either side of it. We'll do that on the next example. Okay, so here is another pi bond. We have O3 and DMS. We could draw that mechanism on the previous slide, but we don't really have to now. We know that we're going to cut this pi bond and put an oxygen at either side. And so what I can do here, I'm going to redraw everything except for the pi bond. And then there's half the pi bond. There's the other half. And I need to put an O on each half. And if I were to redraw this, I could maybe put a longer bond here. There's my carbonyl from the top carbon. There's my carbonyl from the bottom carbon. And I can redraw this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 carbons in a chain. There's my 8 carbons in a chain. I know I have an aldehyde at the first carbon. That's this carbon here. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right here I should have a ketone. And there you go. And of course I would accept either of these drawings as the complete answer to this reaction. So all you have to do is cut the pi bond, add an O to both sides. Let's try that once more. In this case I have 2 pi bonds, and it's safe to assume that we have excess ozone, plenty of ozone. Typically these reactions are done with an oxygen cylinder hooked up to a machine that generates ozone, which has a tube coming out of the other end, and you stick that tube into your reaction flask, bubble ozone into it, and it gets the job done. So we have as much ozone as we need to get the job done. And of course there are 2 pi bonds here that we can cleave, and so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you see here I've cut those pi bonds, and then I just need to add an O to each side. So I've actually created 3 new carbonyl species here. This is an aldehyde with 2 carbons. Got an aldehyde and a ketone in this longer 6-carbon chain, and then I have acetone right here. So unless you're asked to draw the mechanism, drawing the products of an ozonolysis reaction is rather straightforward. Just cut the pi bond, maybe redraw your molecule, and so that you can add an O to each side of that, what used to be the pi bond. You just get 2 carbonyls out of the resulting product.